As I said, we're going to begin the final session for the day. We've moved from an awful lot of really good scientific discussion this morning regarding the disease itself, plus a lot of diagnostics. We're going to take the next 2 hours to present some management ideas from 4 of the states that are involved. We'll start first with Wisconsin, and today we'll have Dr. Mary Wood. Dr. Wood served as the Wyoming State Wildlife Veterinarian since 2013 and currently leads the Veterinary Services Branch of Wyoming Game and Fish Department. She oversees the Wildlife Health Lab, the Wildlife Disease Surveillance Programs, and the Thorne Williams Wildlife Research Center. She chairs the CWD management team and participates in both free-ranging and captive wildlife disease research with a particular interest in CWD and respiratory disease in bighorn sheep. Let's all welcome Dr. Wood.
Well, thanks so much for having me come here and talk to you guys today. As it was mentioned, we're going to kind of bring this level down from really highly academic and detailed talks, which is lots of really awesome information that has come out today. Been super interesting. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about our experience and some of the things we've learned in Wyoming and what we're seeing on the ground in Wyoming. I can't really talk to you at length about management because we actually have not done any management for chronic wasting disease in Wyoming. So I don't have management data to show you, but I do certainly have things to talk about what happens in the absence of management, and certainly what we're seeing on the ground. So I feel like I should welcome Texas to the CWD support group. You know, the first step is admitting you have a problem. And that step's actually been really hard for us in Wyoming, and it's been a big challenge for us to recognize the problem of chronic wasting disease in Wyoming. Now, as you saw, Dr. Richards this morning talked about Wisconsin and how Wisconsin has a problem, and I'm certainly here to tell you that Wyoming definitely has a problem. And it's really unfortunate what we're seeing on the ground with chronic wasting disease in Wyoming. I want to start with the caveat that I can really only speak from my experience in Wyoming. I can't tell you how that necessarily applies elsewhere. There really are some regional differences in chronic wasting disease, and I don't expect this disease to always look the same everywhere. So for what it's worth, in the Rocky Mountain West, we actually have a little bit more of a mule deer-dominated epidemiology of the disease. But we certainly have multiple susceptible cervid species. So we have areas in Wyoming where we have white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, and moose all in the same area, which certainly creates a challenge. We do have much lower cervid densities than at least reported out in the Midwest or in the East, so I think that's worth recognizing. And we do have a lot of populations that are highly migratory. Certainly not all of our populations are migratory, but a lot of them really are. And so I think that creates a different picture than what you may see perhaps in the Midwest or in the East, and certainly a different picture than probably what you see here in Texas. I'll give you the caveat in Wyoming, we actually do not have a captive cervid industry other than we have one private elk ranch that's kind of grandfathered in. So really I'm presenting free-ranging wildlife information, and this is in the absence of a captive cervid industry and what we're seeing. As far as the disease in Wyoming, we of course don't know when it first arrived. Our earliest cases were in the late 1970s at our own captive research facility. And then our first free-ranging cases, mule deer was in 1985 and an elk was in 1986. So we certainly have a long history of this disease in our state. And modeling that was done kind of early on suggests that this disease was probably established decades before we ever found it. So we were unfortunate enough to have this disease established before we ever even discovered the disease itself. So that put us behind the curve quite a bit in trying to deal with this disease, trying to understand this disease, and in trying to recognize the problem. We have done some form of CWD surveillance or monitoring since 1982. Early on, this was really just a research-based, very small scale in collaboration with Dr. Beth Williams. And I think the picture of our sample sizes really mirrors a lot of areas where once federal funding became available, we got more boots on the ground. We increased our sample sizes quite a bit. After that federal funding went away, we certainly saw those sample sizes drop off, and we had this weird, let's see if this will work here, weird lull here where, I don't know, for a while it seemed like nobody really cared about CWD. That has changed, obviously, in recent years. The pot has been stirred, and our surveillance and monitoring has increased a lot. And I think I should give you the caveat, or at least a frame of reference, because some other people are going to talk after me, and when you look at our sample sizes and surveillance, it looks quite a bit different than if you look at probably Missouri or Wisconsin. And I think it's important to recognize in Wyoming, we harvest somewhere in the ballpark of 70 to 80,000 cervids a year. So our harvest is a lot lower than a lot of those areas in the Midwest or East. And our surveillance program is heavily focused on mule deer, because they're sort of our dominant CWD species, and then secondarily focused on elk, and then we kind of throw white-tailed deer in as an afterthought. And our mule deer harvest is probably somewhere in the ballpark of 30,000 a year. So, you know, the numbers that we're dealing with and trying to get good surveillance data and sample sizes is really challenging in Wyoming. And without mandatory testing, which we have not employed, it's really difficult to get good sample sizes. So this has been a struggle. So Dr. Richards kind of helped preface this by talking about this paper by Dr. Miller and Dr. Fisher, which is really a great paper. And they talked about a bunch of those lessons learned about chronic wasting disease. And they talked about surveillance and some of the lessons we learned about surveillance and how challenging good surveillance can really be. And the reality is, of course, the first case detected in an area is so rarely the first case. And I do think that our surveillance in Wyoming illustrates that very well, as I'm sure a lot of states do. This was the known distribution of chronic wasting disease in Wyoming in 1997. So were we looking hard, or were we hardly looking? We were hardly looking. In fact, this is the only place we were looking. Lo and behold, we found it where we were looking. You know, our surveillance program was really small at that point. We only had immunohistochemistry. We didn't have ELISAs. And so, you know, where we looked, we found the disease, but we didn't look very far. This is where we were in 2003. We weren't necessarily looking hard, but we were looking harder. And when we looked harder, we found more disease. But this isn't a change. This isn't like a true spread between 1997 and 2003. Unfortunately, we were finding the disease where it already existed. We were just behind that curve and trying to figure out the extent of the problem in Wyoming, because the more we looked, the more we found, and it was quite surprising. This is where we were by 2010. I think at this point we had done quite a lot of surveillance. We were starting to get a pretty good idea of where this disease existed. Can I tell you that we knew exactly the distribution of this disease even in 2010? No, but I think we were starting to get a good idea of where we were. And this is, of course, where we are today. This disease certainly is spreading. I do believe we're seeing some amount of spread in our state. Unfortunately, our data is really difficult to measure that spread, and it's not something we're able to do with what we have. But we have a pretty wide distribution of chronic wasting disease in Wyoming, and it's pretty sobering to look at. And the more we look, the more we fill in some of our gaps and holes and find that we have a lot of disease in our state, certainly. But for what it's worth, this is our current distribution, known distribution, of chronic wasting disease in elk. So there was kind of several comments earlier today about elk versus deer and some differences. And certainly there are biologic differences between elk and deer, behavioral differences between elk and deer, and certainly I would think that some of those differences really account for some of the change we see as far as distribution of CWD in elk versus in deer. But I do think that one of the other differences that we often don't talk about is actually a big difference in management, and I think this is common in Western areas. We have a pretty significant difference in how we manage our elk populations versus how we manage our deer populations. So our deer populations, in Wyoming at least, and particularly mule deer, tend to be very, very conservatively managed. We manage these populations largely for high buck ratios, trying to manage for that quality deer hunt, and our public really wants this from us. They want this quality deer hunt, they want high buck ratios. Very conservative management, very, very little doe harvest, and really conservative harvest in our deer populations. We harvest most of our deer before the rut, so in actually early to mid-October. Meanwhile, in our elk populations, we actually have some pretty liberal management. We harvest these populations far more aggressively. We harvest both males and females quite aggressively. We harvest elk primarily after the rut. While we have elk seasons running from August through January, the bulk of our harvest is going to be kind of after November in a lot of cases for elk. So we have very significant differences in how we manage these different species. And I do suspect that that also plays a role in why we see a different picture with chronic wasting disease in these two different species. For what it's worth, most of our data and most of the population impacts we really are seeing in Wyoming are in deer. So I'm not going to talk at length about elk because I don't have a ton of time, but I do certainly do quite a bit of captive research, and I work with elk and CWD really up close and personal quite a lot. So happy to talk to folks afterwards about elk and CWD if people are interested. So Dr. Edmonds certainly started us out by talking about his white-tailed deer study. And really we had two of these big studies that came out of Wyoming from a similar area of high CWD prevalence, showing population impacts due to CWD. And these studies have been really helpful in helping us to really kind of take a big look at the situation on the ground in Wyoming, look harder, and try and see what data do we actually have. And the problem that has kind of occurred from these studies, which is pretty interesting, is that both of these studies were done with somewhat similar methods, with capturing some deer, watching them over time, collecting some really great data. And then both studies involved some aspect of a little bit of modeling to go into that. And so just out of curiosity, if you see that a study did modeling, how many of you are more skeptical of that study? Yeah, and I am too. A model is only as good as the data and the assumptions that you put into it. Models can be really, really valuable. They can certainly help us to better understand what's going on. But a model that doesn't have good assumptions can really mislead us too. And I think there tends to be a lot of suspicion on this research because models that are based on really good data but projected forward don't necessarily always predict exactly what you're going to see. And I think we tend to fail to see the data that actually is encompassed in these studies that's really quite beneficial, that's really quite compelling, and tells a story about chronic wasting disease beyond just the model. So I'm not going to talk about the white-tailed deer stuff. I think Dr. Edmonds certainly covered that in depth and knows that data better than I do. But I did want to talk a little bit about the mule deer herd where Dr. DeVivo did her study. So this is our South Converse mule deer herd. And on this graph here, and I'm choosing to point at this other screen just for all of you guys on this side to balance things out. And because I'm a lefty, so it makes it easier. So in this graph up here, this black line, that's our postseason population estimate for that herd. And then the red line is our estimated prevalence for that population, and prevalence is on this axis here. And so certainly in this population, we have had a substantial population decline. And that does seem to coincide with a pretty big increase in prevalence, where prevalence actually peaked at almost 50% in adult bucks. And it's the highest prevalence we have seen in the state, quite significant. And Dr. DeVito's study basically said, okay, a 21% annual decline. And one of the issues that we have run into is looking at our data and looking at this right here. That doesn't look like a 21% annual decline right there, right? So we actually grew some deer. And I think that's real. We did grow some deer in that population. We had a few good summers, lots of forage available, and we had really fantastic fawn recruitment, kind of out of this world fawn recruitment. And that population was able to grow a bit because we were recruiting so many fawns into that population, not because adult survival changed. And so I think people tend to look at that and think that, oh, well, these studies maybe aren't that accurate because they failed to predict what is actually happening. And I think what's really hard to understand is, at least in mule deer populations in Wyoming, weather is a really significant driver of population dynamics. So a harsh winter can cause a really big drop in a population. Drought years, things like that cause dips. And then good summers, good forage can cause a pretty big increase. So what we're seeing with chronic wasting disease in this population is not necessarily a steady 21% annual decline, though this population has declined significantly, and that was certainly occurring during Dr. DeVivo's work. What we seem to be seeing is that overall, chronic wasting disease is suppressing this population. So in times where we have really good conditions and we can recruit a lot of fawns, we can grow some deer in the presence of a lot of CWD. but we can't grow as many deer as we could without CWD. So our peaks in this population are lower. And then during years where conditions are not good and you have harsh winter and you have droughts, things like that, well then it's almost as though the effects of CWD are magnitude, because you're gonna have your troughs significantly lower. And I can't tell you what this is gonna do when repeated over time in the long term, but what I can tell you is yes, this disease is having a negative impact on this population. It is suppressing that population overall, and we're really quite concerned about it. And I think that Dr. DeVivo's data really illustrates this. Her study was done during a time when conditions were poor. It was done during a time we had a harsh winter, we had some drought years. That population would have been struggling anyway. Even looking at adult female survival in a CWD negative animal was 79%. West-wide average of female doe survival in mule deer is maybe 82 to 85%. So this was already low. But once you added CWD in that mix, when you looked across the population, sort of your cumulative adult survival was 65 to 73%. And that is a declining population. Certainly CWD is having a big impact. And what's interesting is, of course, you also look at that mortality data, where the top causes of mortality are mountain lion predation and chronic wasting disease. And so this is pretty significant, and we're seeing a really, really tough impact in this population, and it's pretty hard to try and figure out what to do about it. And unfortunately, in Wyoming, we have this beautiful greater Yellowstone ecosystem where we have these big, fantastic populations. They're really shiny, and there's lots of grant money that leads to lots of research in western Wyoming. But we don't actually have a whole lot of data in eastern Wyoming. And you may notice that, Dr. DeVivo's study started in maybe around 2010. Well, gee, this population was declining long before that. And that's not something that we were really necessarily raising the alarm bells about. And the reality is this management data is rough and raw, and it's kind of hard to interpret. And the question is, given that we had this going on in this population and really weren't recognizing it, what else do we have going on that we're not seeing in some of these areas where we've had the disease for a long time at high prevalence? So we're just now starting to go in and look at some other areas to try and see what the picture is. So this is our Bates Hole mule deer herd, and it's literally adjacent to South Converse. So that's South Converse right here, and then that's our Bates Hole. And we collared some doe mule deer to try and get a feel for what are we seeing there. And at least in the first year of the study, our annual survival was 73%. Other populations that we've looked at had a survival more like 80%. And our leading causes of mortality are mountain lion predation and clinical chronic wasting disease. Prevalence in this population is around 27% in adult buck deer, and we're probably at a precipice right here in this population where impacts may become more significant if prevalence really increases, and we're going to start seeing some real problems. So I think we have more problems than we really even know about at this time. We're just now starting to dig in and collect that data. So in general, just looking at our CWD surveillance data and prevalence, in a lot of populations that we have historically considered, hey, low prevalence populations, the disease is here, but there's not a lot of it. Boy, we're seeing prevalence increasing across the board. This doesn't actually include our current year's surveillance because we're still finishing up that data, but some of these populations are taking even bigger jumps this year as we get good sample sizes. When we look at our high prevalence populations, it's pretty interesting. We have some areas where it seems like CWD is just kind of climbing away up into the 40% range. And then we have some where South Converse kind of seems to maybe have leveled off a little bit. Our sample sizes are not great because that population is really conservatively managed. We don't have a lot of harvest. But I think our Laramie Mountain mule deer population is really interesting, where it did have a dip in prevalence, and I do think that's a real dip in prevalence. That kind of coincided with a population dip due to drought and other factors on the ground, and then a subsequent flood of younger animals coming in where we kind of flooded that population with young animals. And I think we did see a shift in prevalence, but it's been about 4 or so years since we got that flood of young animals, and our prevalence estimates this year are probably around 27 or 28%, so it's bumping back up again. And this is where I think there's a lot to be learned from what we're seeing in our state and some of our data. And some of it really is the fact that this disease is significant. there are negative impacts, but we need to be realistic about what that means in the broader scale and not pretend that normal population dynamics don't also play a role in what you see on the ground. And be really open and upfront about that, because if we predict all populations are going to immediately go extinct, that's not going to come true, and we're going to lose trust in trying to maybe oversell the issue here. But this is certainly a significant disease. Dr. Richards actually talked about this as well as Dr. Samuels, where in general, prevalence in bucks tends to be higher than does. I don't think this is necessarily true everywhere, but in a lot of places and pretty consistently we've seen that. And then prevalence in these prime age older bucks is higher as well. So of course the question is what happens with these bucks over time, and folks have kind of talked about this. Based on what we know about the disease, you would expect at high prevalence over time, you're going to start to see these older bucks dropping out of the population. And unfortunately, that's what we're starting to see in Wyoming. So I will give you the caveat that this is some raw management data. It ain't perfect by far. There's certainly lots of caveats that come with it. But this graph here, we have a classification of our bucks, so the percent of class 2 or 3 bucks. So those are measured based on antler spread. So, you know, older age class 2 and 3 are bucks that have a bigger antler spread. They're a more mature buck. And then this here is prevalence. And it really does seem that as we have higher prevalence in some of these populations, those older bucks are starting to drop out of the population. This is really rough, raw data. You know, I don't necessarily put 100% stock into it, but what I do put a lot of stock into is our managers on the ground. And they go out and they're going to fly. In fact, they're flying right now over these populations every December to do counts and classification to look at those deer on the ground. And they come back down from their flights, and these folks that are flying over these high prevalence populations, they come back and they tell you, you know, I can see the difference between 30% prevalence and 10% prevalence when I fly over this population. It's a visible difference. So you have to keep in mind that these are really conservatively managed populations. And the reality is one of the big drivers for Dr. DeVivo's study was not just that that population was declining, but it was because our local managers on the ground were flying that population year after year, and the older bucks were just gone. They weren't seeing them. And they got more conservative with their management, and more conservative with their management, and more conservative, but they couldn't grow big bucks. They just were gone, and that was one of the big drivers actually for Dr. DeVivo's study, and we're seeing that in other areas too. So it's really quite compelling when we look at the fact that management and implications of this disease may be more than just what happens to numbers of the population, but you might be seeing a change in your age structure. But this is probably only evident in more conservatively managed populations. If you have a really aggressive harvest and things like that, you may not necessarily notice this effect. So overall, we certainly are seeing impacts due to chronic wasting disease in Wyoming. This disease is affecting hunting in Wyoming, certainly. And this disease is probably impacting the age structure of our populations where we have high prevalence, which is pretty unfortunate. And I guess one other lesson learned, I don't necessarily always want to highlight this, is one other thing we've actually learned is that messaging around chronic wasting disease matters. So for a long time, we talked about this disease. Every news release that went out there, every website on CWD, every fact sheet showed a picture like this deer. And at least we found in Wyoming that actually led to some misunderstanding by our hunting community on what CWD looks like. And we would time and time again notify someone that they harvested a positive deer, and they would say, no, your test is wrong because that's the fattest mule deer I've ever seen. And unfortunately, this visual message has hit home, and it really has kind of led our hunters maybe into a false sense of security that if they harvest a fat animal, it can't have CWD, and therefore they maybe don't need to have it tested. So that is one thing that we certainly have learned in Wyoming. I think one of the hardest lessons for us to learn, and the hardest lesson to learn on CWD in general, I think most people would say would be that timeline. And that, we didn't get to this point overnight. This took a long time. This took decades. And this was tough for us in Wyoming because, of course, we found this disease so early on, and we had no idea what this disease was or what to think about it. Really no information, no data to go on when this disease was first discovered in our state. And our agency took a relatively conservative approach to the disease and said, okay, we're going to monitor this, we'll put some money into research, and we're going to see what happens over time. And 5 years went by, 10 years went by, 15 years went by, and we didn't see an impact on the ground. Our public didn't see, our agency didn't see an impact. And we did start to message that there wasn't an impact and that maybe this disease was not a concern. And unfortunately, it took us over 30 years to realize that we were wrong. And to realize that, yes, we do have an impact, and that's visible and measurable on the ground. And now we're faced with trying to manage for this disease, and we are trying to manage for this disease, but also trying to turn that message around and turn that ship around to convince, honestly, our own agency personnel who spent 10 or 15 years saying this disease isn't a problem, and now have to actually turn that message around and to convince our public of that. We would like to move forward with management, and we have dedicated ourselves to move forward with management and management options for this disease. But unfortunately, the communication step is pretty astronomical in our state before we're going to be able to get support to do management, because everything we've learned about management is that it's not going to be quick and it's not going to be easy. So if it took us decades to get to 40% prevalence in Wyoming, we can't expect that a management action is going to have massive effect in just a couple of years. We're looking at decades worth of management, perhaps permanent long-term management for chronic wasting disease. And that's a really hard concept to wrap your head around, and it's a really hard concept to get public support to do. I do think that there is some data out there to suggest that there are management strategies that may at least help to limit this disease. But we're certainly really worried in Wyoming that some of our populations that are quite high prevalence, we might have really missed our opportunity to have an impact on what's going on the ground. That being said, we have a lot of populations that are still low prevalence. We have a lot of opportunity still to move forward, to start working towards management, to start seeing if we can find some different strategies that might be effective. And I think one of the first things we should probably do is look at our elk management and talk a little bit about what we're doing with elk, because there's a good chance that some of the way we're managing elk may be actually having an impact on that disease. And so really looking at harvest strategies and harvest management is probably our best chance as a management agency to try and limit this disease to the best we can until maybe we do have some more efficacious tools available to us. So with that, while it's kind of nice, it feels awfully warm here in Texas at 50 degrees. Our folks are out there in the snow, still collecting samples. We have elk seasons going on right now. Our folks are flying. And then certainly I think we're maybe the only agency, the only state wildlife agency that does our own chronic wasting disease testing in-house in our wildlife health laboratory. And those guys are up to their eyeballs in lymph nodes right now doing lots of testing. And certainly those folks are all the ones that are out there on the ground collecting all of this data for us. So many, many thanks to those great folks. And that's all I got.